Book 2, Chapter 1
of The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett.
Book 2, Constance. Chapter 1 Revolution. 1. "Well," said Mr. Povey, rising from the rocking-chair that in a previous age had been John Baines's, "I've got to make a start some time, so I might as well begin now." And he went from the parlour into the shop. Constance's eye followed him as far as the door, where their glances met for an instant, in the transient gaze which expresses the tenderness of people who feel more than they kiss. It was on the morning of this day that Mrs. Baines, relinquishing the sovereignty of St. Luke's Square, had gone to live as a younger sister in the house of Harriet Maddock at Axe. Constance guessed little of the secret anguish of that departure. She only knew that it was just like her mother, having perfectly arranged the entire house for the arrival of the honeymoon couple from Buxton, to flit early away so as to spare the natural blushing diffidence of the said couple. It was like her mother's common sense and her mother's sympathetic comprehension. Further, Constance did not pursue her mother's feelings, being far too busy with her own. She sat there full of new knowledge and new importance, brimming with experience and strange unexpected aspirations, purposes, yes, and cunnings. And yet, though the very curves of her cheeks seemed to be mysteriously altering, the old Constance still lingered in that frame, an innocent soul, hesitating to spread its wings and quit for ever the body which had been its home. You could see the timid thing peeping wistfully out of the eyes of the married woman. Constance rang the bell for Maggie to clear the table, and as she did so she had the illusion that she was not really a married woman and a house-mistress, but only a kind of counterfeit. She did most fervently hope that all would go right in the house, at any rate until she had grown more accustomed to her situation. The hope was to be disappointed. Maggie's rather silly, obsequious smile concealed but for a moment the ineffable tragedy that had lain in wait for alarmed Constance. "If you please, Mrs. Povey," as she crushed cups together on the tin tray with her great red hands, which always looked like something out of a butcher's shop. Then a pause. "Will you please accept of this?" Now, before the wedding, Maggie had already, with tears of affection, given Constance a pair of blue glass vases, in order to purchase which she had been obliged to ask for special permission to go out, and Constance wondered what was coming now from Maggie's pocket. A small piece of folded paper came from Maggie's pocket. Constance accepted of it, and read: "I begs to give 1 month's notice to leave. Signed, Maggie. June the 10th, 1867. "Maggie!" exclaimed the old Constance, terrified by this incredible occurrence, ere the married woman could strangle her. "I never give notice before, Mrs. Povey," said Maggie, "so I don't know as I know how it ought to be done, not rightly. But I hope as you'll accept of it, Mrs. Povey." "Oh, of course," said Mrs. Povey primly, just as if Maggie was not the central supporting pillar of the house, just as if Maggie had not assisted at her birth, just as if the end of the world had not abruptly been announced, just as if St. Luke's Square were not inconceivable without Maggie. But why? "Well, Mrs. Povey, I've been a-thinking of it over in my kitchen, and I said to myself, if there's going to be one change there'd better be two, I says. Not but what I wouldn't work my fingers to the bone for you, Miss Constance." Here Maggie began to cry into the tray. Constance looked at her. Despite the special muslin of that day, she had traces of the slatternliness of which Mrs. Baines had never been able to cure her. She was over 40, big, gawky. She had no figure, no charms of any kind. She was what was left of a woman after 22 years in the cave of a philanthropic family. And in her cave she had actually been thinking things over. Constance detected for the first time beneath the dehumanised drudge the stirrings of a separate and perhaps capricious individuality. Maggie's engagements had never been real to her employers. Within the house she had never been, in practice, anything but Maggie, an organism, and now she was permitting herself ideas about changes. "You'll soon be suited with another, Mrs. Povey," said Maggie. "There's many a—" She burst into sobs. "But if you really want to leave, what are you crying for, Maggie?" asked Mrs. Povey at her wisest. "Have you told mother?" "No, miss." Maggie whimpered absently, wiping her wrinkled cheeks with ineffectual muslin. "I couldn't seem to fancy telling your mother, and as you're the mistress now, I thought as I'd save it for you when you come home. I hope you'll excuse me, Mrs. Povey. Of course I'm very sorry. You've been a very good servant, and in these days—" The child had acquired this turn of speech from her mother. It did not appear to occur to either of them that they were living in the 60s. "Thank you, miss." "And what are you thinking of doing, Maggie? You know you won't get many places like this." "To tell you the truth, Mrs. Povey, I'm going to get married mysen." "Indeed," murmured Constance, with the perfunctoriness of habit in replying to these tidings. "Oh, but I am, mum," Maggie insisted. "It's all settled. Mr. Hollins, mum." "Not Hollins, the fish hawker?" "Yes, mum, I seem to fancy him. You don't remember as him and me was engaged in '48? He was my first, like. I broke it off because he was in that Chartist lot, and I knew as Mr. Baines would never stand that. Now he's asked me again. He's been a widower this long time." "I'm sure I hope you'll be happy, Maggie. But what about his habits?" "You won't have no habits with me, Mrs. Povey." A woman was definitely emerging from the drudge. When Maggie, having entirely ceased sobbing, had put the folded cloth in the table drawer and departed with the tray, her mistress became frankly the girl again. No primness about her as she stood alone there in the parlour, no pretence that Maggie's notice to leave was an everyday document, to be casually glanced at, as one glances at an unpaid bill. She would be compelled to find a new servant, making solemn inquiries into character, and to train the new servant, and to talk to her from heights from which she had never addressed Maggie. At that moment she had an illusion that there were no other available suitable servants in the whole world. And the arranged marriage? She felt that this time, the 13th or 14th time, the engagement was serious, and would only end at the altar. The vision of Maggie and Hollins at the altar shocked her. Marriage was a series of phenomena, and a general state, very holy and wonderful, too sacred somehow for such creatures as Maggie and Hollins. Her vague instinctive revolt against such a usage of matrimony centred round the idea of a strong eternal smell of fish. However, the projected outrage on a hallowed institution troubled her much less than the imminent problem of domestic service. She ran into the shop, or she would have run if she had not checked her girlishness betimes, and on her lips, ready to be whispered importantly into her husband's astounded ear, were the words, "Maggie has given notice. Yes, truly." But Samuel Povey was engaged. He was leaning over the counter and staring at an outspread paper upon which a certain Mr. Yardley was making strokes with a thick pencil. Mr. Yardley, who had a long red beard, painted houses and rooms. She knew him only by sight. In her mind she always associated him with the sign over his premises in Trafalgar Road: Yardley Bros, authorised plumbers, painters, decorators, paper hangers, fascia writers. For years in childhood she had passed that sign without knowing what sort of things Bros and fascia were, and what was the mysterious similarity between a plumber and a version of the Bible. She could not interrupt her husband. He was wholly absorbed, nor could she stay in the shop, which appeared just a little smaller than usual, for that would have meant an unsuccessful endeavour to front the young lady assistants, as though nothing in particular had happened to her. So she went sedately up the showroom stairs, and thus to the bedroom floors of the house. Her house, Mrs. Povey's house. She even climbed to Constance's old bedroom. Her mother had stripped the bed, that was all, except a slight diminution of this room, corresponding to that of the shop. Then to the drawing-room. In the recess outside the drawing-room door the black box of silver plate still lay. She had expected her mother to take it, but no, assuredly her mother was one to do things handsomely, when she did them. In the drawing-room not a tassel of an antimacassar touched. Yes, the fire-screen, the luscious bunch of roses on an expanse of mustard, which Constance had worked for her mother years ago, was gone. That her mother should have clung to just that one souvenir, out of all the heavy opulence of the drawing-room, touched Constance intimately. She perceived that if she could not talk to her husband, she must write to her mother, and she sat down at the oval table and wrote: "Darling Mother, I am sure you will be very surprised to hear." She means it. I think she is making a serious mistake. Ought I to put an advertisement in the Signal, or will it do if... Please write by return. We are back and have enjoyed ourselves very much. Sam says he enjoys getting up late. And so on to the last inch of the 4th scalloped page. She was obliged to revisit the shop for a stamp, stamps being kept in Mr. Povey's desk in the corner, a high desk at which you stood. Mr. Povey was now in earnest converse with Mr. Yardley at the door, and twilight, which began a full hour earlier in the shop than in the square, had cast faint shadows in corners behind counters. "Will you just run out with this to the pillar, Miss Dad?" "With pleasure, Mrs. Povey." "Where are you going to?" Mr. Povey interrupted his conversation to stop the flying girl. "She's just going to the post for me," Constance called out from the region of the till. "Oh, all right." A trifle, a nothing, yet somehow, in the quiet, customerless shop, the episode, with the scarce perceptible difference in Samuel's tone at his second remark, was delicious to Constance. Somehow it was the real beginning of her wifehood. There had been about 9 other real beginnings in the past fortnight. Mr. Povey came in to supper, laden with ledgers and similar works, which Constance had never even pretended to understand. It was a sign from him that the honeymoon was over. He was proprietor now, and his ardour for ledgers most justifiable. Still, there was the question of her servant. "Never!" he exclaimed when she told him about the end of the world. Never, which expressed extreme astonishment and the liveliest concern. But Constance had anticipated that he would have been just a little more knocked down, bowled over, staggered, stunned, flabbergasted. In a swift gleam of insight she saw that she had been in danger of forgetting her role of experienced, capable, married woman. "I shall have to set about getting a fresh one," she said hastily, with an admirable assumption of light and easy casualness. Mr. Povey seemed to think that Hollins would suit Maggie pretty well. He made no remark to the betrothed when she answered the final bell of the night. He opened his ledgers, whistling. "I think I shall go up, dear," said Constance. "I've got a lot of things to put away." "Do," said he. "Call out when you've done." 2. "Sam!" she cried from the top of the crooked stairs. No answer. The door at the foot was closed. "Sam!" "Hullo!" Distantly, faintly. "I've done all I'm going to do tonight." And she ran back along the corridor, a white figure in the deep gloom, and hurried into bed and drew the clothes up to her chin. In the life of a bride there are some dramatic moments. If she has married the industrious apprentice, one of those moments occurs when she first occupies the sacred bedchamber of her ancestors, and the bed on which she was born. Her parents' room had always been to Constance, if not sacred, at least invested with a certain moral solemnity. She could not enter it as she would enter another room. The course of nature, with its succession of deaths, conceptions, and births, slowly makes such a room august, with a mysterious quality which interprets the grandeur of mere existence and imposes itself on all. Constance had the strangest sensations in that bed, whose heavy dignity of ornament symbolized a past age. Sensations of sacrilege and trespass, of being a naughty girl, to whom punishment would accrue for this shocking freak. Not since she was quite tiny had she slept in that bed. One night with her mother, before her father's seizure, when he had been away. What a limitless, unfathomable bed it was then! Now it was just a bed, so she had to tell herself, like any other bed. The tiny child that, safely touching its mother, had slept in the vast expanse, seemed to her now a pathetic little thing. Its image made her feel melancholy, and her mind dwelt on sad events. The death of her father, the flight of darling Sophia, the immense grief and the exile of her mother. She esteemed that she knew what life was, and that it was grim, and she sighed. But the sigh was an affectation, meant partly to convince herself that she was grown up, and partly to keep her in countenance in the intimidating bed. This melancholy was factitious, was less than transient foam on the deep sea of her joy. Death and sorrow and sin were dim shapes to her. The ruthless egoism of happiness blew them away with a puff, and their wistful faces vanished. To see her there in the bed, framed in mahogany and tassels, lying on her side, with her young glowing cheeks, and honest but not artless gaze, and the rich curve of her hip lifting the counterpane, one would have said that she had never heard of aught but love. Mr. Povey entered, the bridegroom, quickly, firmly, carrying it off rather well, but still self-conscious. After all, his shoulders were trying to say, what's the difference between this bedroom and the bedroom of a boarding-house? Indeed, ought we not to feel more at home here? Besides, confound it, we've been married a fortnight. Doesn't it give you a funny feeling, sleeping in this room? It does me, said Constance. Women, even experienced women, are so foolishly frank. They have no decency, no self-respect. Really? Replied Mr. Povey, with loftiness, as who should say, what an extraordinary thing that a reasonable creature can have such fancies. Now to me this room is exactly like any other room. And he added aloud, glancing away from the glass, where he was unfastening his necktie, it's not a bad room at all. This with the judicial air of an auctioneer. Not for an instant did he deceive Constance, who read his real sensations with accuracy. But his futile poses did not in the slightest degree lessen her respect for him. On the contrary, she admired him the more for them. They were a sort of embroidery on the solid stuff of his character. At that period he could not do wrong for her. The basis of her regard for him was, she often thought, his honesty, his industry, his genuine kindliness of act, his grasp of the business, his perseverance, his passion for doing at once that which had to be done. She had the greatest admiration for his qualities, and he was in her eyes an indivisible whole. She could not admire one part of him and frown upon another. Whatever he did was good because he did it. She knew that some people were apt to smile at certain phases of his individuality. She knew that far down in her mother's heart was a suspicion that she had married ever so little beneath her. But this knowledge did not disturb her. She had no doubt as to the correctness of her own estimate. Mr. Povey was an exceedingly methodical person, and he was also one of those persons who must always be beforehand with time. Thus, at night he would arrange his raiment so that in the morning it might be reassumed in the minimum of minutes. He was not a man, for example, to leave the changing of studs from one shirt to another till the morrow. Had it been practicable, he would have brushed his hair the night before. Constance already loved to watch his meticulous preparations. She saw him now go into his old bedroom and return with a paper collar, which he put on the dressing-table next to a black necktie. His shop suit was laid out on a chair. "Oh, Sam!" she exclaimed impulsively, "you surely aren't going to begin wearing those horrid paper collars again?" During the honeymoon he had worn linen collars. Her tone was perfectly gentle, but the remark nevertheless showed a lack of tact. It implied that all his life Mr. Povey had been enveloping his neck in something which was horrid. Like all persons with a tendency to fall into the ridiculous, Mr. Povey was exceedingly sensitive to personal criticisms. He flushed darkly. "I didn't know they were horrid," he snapped. He was hurt and angry. Anger had surprised him unawares. Both of them suddenly saw that they were standing on the edge of a chasm, and drew back. They had imagined themselves to be wandering safely in a flowered meadow, and here was this bottomless chasm. It was most disconcerting. Mr. Povey's hand hovered undecided over the collar. "However," he muttered. She could feel that he was trying with all his might to be gentle and pacific, and she was aghast at her own stupid clumsiness, she so experienced. "Just as you like, dear," she said quickly. "Please." "Oh no," and he did his best to smile, and went off gawkily with the collar, and came back with a linen one. Her passion for him burned stronger than ever. She knew then that she did not love him for his good qualities, but for something boyish and naive that there was about him, an indescribable something that occasionally, when his face was close to hers, made her dizzy. The chasm had disappeared. In such moments, when each must pretend not to have seen or even suspected the chasm, small talk is essential. "Wasn't that Mr. Yardley in the shop to-night?" began Constance. "Yes." "What did he want?" "I'd sent for him. He's going to paint us a signboard." Useless for Samuel to make believe that nothing in this world is more ordinary than a signboard. "Oh!" murmured Constance. She said no more, the episode of the paper collar having weakened her self-confidence. But a signboard! What with servants, chasms, and signboards, Constance considered that her life as a married woman would not be deficient in excitement. Long afterwards she fell asleep, thinking of Sophia. 3. A few days later, Constance was arranging the more precious of her wedding presents in the parlour. Some had to be wrapped in tissue and in brown paper, and then tied with string and labelled. Others had special cases of their own, leather without and velvet within. Among the latter was the resplendent egg-stand, holding 12 silver-gilt egg-cups and 12 chased spoons to match, presented by Aunt Harriet. In the Five Towns phrase, it must have cost money. Even if Mr. and Mrs. Povey had 10 guests or 10 children, and all the 12 of them were simultaneously gripped by a desire to eat eggs at breakfast or tea, even in this remote contingency Aunt Harriet would have been pained to see the egg-stand in use. Such treasures are not designed for use. The presents, few in number, were mainly of this character, because, owing to her mother's heroic cession of the entire interior, Constance already possessed every necessary. The fewness of the presents was accounted for by the fact that the wedding had been strictly private, and had taken place at Axe. There is nothing like secrecy in marriage for discouraging the generous impulses of one's friends. It was Mrs. Baines, abetted by both the chief parties, who had decided that the wedding should be private and secluded. Sophia's wedding had been altogether too private and secluded, but the casting of a veil over Constance's, whose union was irreproachable, somehow justified, after the event, the circumstances of Sophia's, indicating, as it did, that Mrs. Baines believed in secret weddings on principle. In such matters, Mrs. Baines was capable of extraordinary subtlety. And while Constance was thus taking her wedding presents with due seriousness, Maggie was cleaning the steps that led from the pavement of King Street to the side door, and the door was ajar. It was a fine June morning. Suddenly, over the sound of scouring, Constance heard a dog's low growl, and then the hoarse voice of a man. "Better in, wench?" "Happen he is, happen he isn't," came Maggie's answer. She had no fancy for being called wench. Constance went to the door, not merely from curiosity, but from a feeling that her authority and her responsibilities as housemistress extended to the pavement surrounding the house. The famous James Boone of Buck Row, the greatest dog fancier in the Five Towns, stood at the bottom of the steps, a tall, fat man, clad in stiff, stained brown, and smoking a black clay pipe less than 3 inches long. Behind him attended 2 bulldogs. "Morning, missus," cried Boone cheerfully. "I've heard tell as the mister is looking out for a dog, as you might say." "I don't stay here with them animals a sniffing at me, that I don't," observed Maggie, picking herself up. "Is he?" Constance hesitated. She knew that Samuel had vaguely referred to dogs. She had not, however, imagined that he regarded a dog as aught but a beautiful dream. No dog had ever put paw into that house, and it seemed impossible that one should ever do so. As for those beasts of prey on the pavement... "Aye," said James Boone calmly. "I'll tell him you're here," said Constance, "but I don't know if he's at liberty. He seldom is at this time of day. Maggie, you'd better come in." She went slowly to the shop, full of fear for the future. "Sam," she whispered to her husband, who was writing at his desk, "here's a man come to see you about a dog." Assuredly he was taken aback. Still he behaved with much presence of mind. "Oh, about a dog. Who is it?" "It's that Jim Boone. He says he's heard you want one." The renowned name of Jim Boone gave him pause, but he had to go through with the affair, and he went through it, though nervously. Constance followed his agitated footsteps to the side door. "Morning, Boone." "Morning, master." They began to talk dogs, Mr. Povey, for his part, with due caution. "Now there's a dog," said Boone, pointing to one of the bulldogs, a miracle of splendid ugliness. "Yes," responded Mr. Povey, insincerely, "he is a beauty. What's it worth now, at a venture?" "I'll tak 120 sovereigns for her," said Boone. "T'other's a bit cheaper, 100." "Oh, Sam!" gasped Constance, and even Mr. Povey nearly lost his nerve. "That's more than I want to give," said he timidly. "But look at her," Boone persisted, roughly snatching up the more expensive animal and displaying her cannibal teeth. Mr. Povey shook his head. Constance glanced away. "That's not quite the sort of dog I want," said Mr. Povey. "Fox terrier?" "Yes, that's more like," Mr. Povey agreed eagerly. "What'll you run to?" "Oh," said Mr. Povey largely, "I don't know." "Will you run to a tenner?" "I thought of something cheaper." "Well, how much? Out with it, mister." "Not more than £2," said Mr. Povey. He would have said £1 had he dared. The prices of dogs amazed him. "I thought it was the dog you wanted," said Boone. "Look here, mister, come up to my yard and see what I've got." "I will," said Mr. Povey. "And bring missus along too. Now, what about a cat for the missus, and a goldfish?" The end of the episode was that a young lady, aged some 12 months, entered the Povey household on trial. Her exiguous legs twinkled all over the parlour, and she had the oddest appearance in the parlour, but she was so confiding, so affectionate, so timorous, and her black nose was so icy in that hot weather, that Constance loved her violently within an hour. Mr. Povey made rules for her. He explained to her that she must never, never go into the shop. But she went, and he whipped her to the squealing point, and Constance cried an instant, while admiring her husband's firmness. The dog was not all. On another day, Constance, prying into the least details of the parlour, discovered a box of cigars inside the lid of the harmonium, on the keyboard. She was so unaccustomed to cigars that at first she did not realise what the object was. Her father had never smoked, nor drunk intoxicants, nor had Mr. Critchlow. Nobody had ever smoked in that house, where tobacco had always been regarded as equally licentious with cards, the devil's playthings. Certainly Samuel had never smoked in the house, though the sight of the cigar box reminded Constance of an occasion when her mother had announced an incredulous suspicion that Mr. Povey, fresh from an excursion into the world on a Thursday evening, smelt of smoke. She closed the harmonium and kept silence. That very night, coming suddenly into the parlour, she caught Samuel at the harmonium. The lid went down with a resonant bang that awoke sympathetic vibrations in every corner of the room. "What is it?" Constance inquired, jumping. "Oh, nothing," replied Mr. Povey carelessly. Each was deceiving the other. Mr. Povey hid his crime, and Constance hid her knowledge of his crime. False, false! But this is what marriage is. And the next day Constance had a visit in the shop from a possible new servant, recommended to her by Mr. Hall, the grocer. "Will you please step this way?" said Constance, with affable primness, steeped in the novel sense of what it is to be the sole responsible mistress of a vast household. She preceded the girl to the parlour, and as they passed the open door of Mr. Povey's cutting-out room, Constance had the clear vision and titillating odour of her husband smoking a cigar. He was in his shirt-sleeves, calmly cutting out, and Fan, the lady companion, at watch on the bench, yapped at the possible new servant. "I think I shall try that girl," said she to Samuel at tea. She said nothing as to the cigar, nor did he. On the following evening, after supper, Mr. Povey burst out: "I think I'll have a weed. You didn't know I smoked, did you?" Thus Mr. Povey came out in his true colours, as a blood, a blade, and a gay spark. But dogs and cigars, disconcerting enough in their degree, were to the signboard, when the signboard at last came, as skim milk is to hot brandy. It was the signboard that, more startlingly than anything else, marked the dawn of a new era in St. Luke's Square. 4 men spent a day and a half in fixing it. They had ladders, ropes, and pulleys, and 2 of them dined on the flat lead roof of the projecting shop windows. The signboard was 35 feet long and 2 feet in depth. Over its centre was a semicircle about 3 feet in radius. This semicircle bore the legend, judiciously disposed: S. Povey, late. All the signboard proper was devoted to the words "John Baines," in gold letters 1.5 feet high, on a green ground. The square watched and wondered, and murmured, "Well, bless us, what next?" It was agreed that in giving paramount importance to the name of his late father-in-law, Mr. Povey had displayed a very nice feeling. Some asked with glee, "What'll the old lady have to say?" Constance asked herself this, but not with glee. When Constance walked down the square homewards, she could scarcely bear to look at the sign. The thought of what her mother would say frightened her. Her mother's first visit of state was imminent, and Aunt Harriet was to accompany her. Constance felt almost sick as the day approached. When she faintly hinted her apprehensions to Samuel, he demanded, as if surprised: "Haven't you mentioned it in one of your letters?" "Oh, no." "If that's all," said he with bravado, "I'll write and tell her myself." 4. So Mrs. Baines was duly apprised of the signboard before her arrival. The letter written by her to Constance after receiving Samuel's letter, which was merely the amiable epistle of a son-in-law anxious to be a little more than correct, contained no reference to the signboard. This silence, however, did not in the least allay Constance's apprehensions as to what might occur when her mother and Samuel met beneath the signboard itself. It was therefore with a fearful as well as an eager, loving heart that Constance opened her side door and ran down the steps when the wagonette stopped in King Street on the Thursday morning of the great visit of the sisters. But a surprise awaited her. Aunt Harriet had not come. Mrs. Baines explained, as she soundly kissed her daughter, that at the last moment Aunt Harriet had not felt well enough to undertake the journey. She sent her fondest love and cake. Her pains had recurred. It was these mysterious pains which had prevented the sisters from coming to Bursley earlier. The word "cancer," the continual terror of stout women, had been on their lips, without having been actually uttered. Then there was a surcease, and each was glad that she had refrained from the dread syllables. In view of the recurrence, it was not unnatural that Mrs. Baines's vigorous cheerfulness should be somewhat forced. "What is it, do you think?" Constance inquired. Mrs. Baines pushed her lips out and raised her eyebrows, a gesture which meant that the pains might mean God knew what. "I hope she'll be all right alone," observed Constance. "Of course," said Mrs. Baines quickly. "But you don't suppose I was going to disappoint you, do you?" she added, looking round as if to defy the fates in general. This speech and its tone gave intense pleasure to Constance, and laden with parcels they mounted the stairs together, very content with each other, very happy in the discovery that they were still mother and daughter, very intimate in an inarticulate way. Constance had imagined long, detailed, absorbing, and highly novel conversations between herself and her mother upon this, their first meeting after her marriage, but alone in the bedroom, and with a clear half-hour to dinner, they neither of them seemed to have a great deal to impart. Mrs. Baines slowly removed her light mantle, and laid it with precautions on the white damask counterpane. Then, fingering her weeds, she glanced about the chamber. Nothing was changed. Though Constance had, previous to her marriage, envisaged certain alterations, she had determined to postpone them, feeling that one revolutionist in the house was enough. "Well, my chick, you're right," said Mrs. Baines, with hearty and direct energy, gazing straight into her daughter's eyes. Constance perceived that the question was universal in its comprehensiveness, the one unique expression that the mother would give to her maternal concern and curiosity, and that it condensed into 6 words as much interest as would have overflowed into a whole day of the chatter of some mothers. She met the candid glance, flushing. "Oh, yes," she answered, with ecstatic fervour. "Perfectly." And Mrs. Baines nodded, as if dismissing that. "You're stouter," said she curtly. "If you aren't careful, you'll be as big as any of us." "Oh, mother!" The interview fell into a lower plane of emotion. It even fell as far as Maggie. What chiefly preoccupied Constance was a subtle change in her mother. She found her mother fussy in trifles. Her manner of laying down her mantle, of smoothing out her gloves, and her anxiety that her bonnet should not come to harm, were rather trying, were perhaps in the very slightest degree pitiable. It was nothing, it was barely perceptible, and yet it was enough to alter Constance's mental attitude to her mother. "Poor dear," thought Constance, "I'm afraid she's not what she was." Incredible that her mother could have aged in less than 6 weeks. Constance did not allow for the chemistry that had been going on in herself. The encounter between Mrs. Baines and her son-in-law was of the most satisfactory nature. He was waiting in the parlour for her to descend. He made himself exceedingly agreeable, kissing her and flattering her by his evidently sincere desire to please. He explained that he had kept an eye open for a wagonette, but had been called away. His "Dear me," on learning about Aunt Harriet, lacked nothing in conviction, though both women knew that his affection for Aunt Harriet would never get the better of his reason. To Constance, her husband's behaviour was marvellously perfect. She had not suspected him to be such a man of the world, and her eyes said to her mother, quite unconsciously, "You see, after all, you didn't rate Sam as high as you ought to have done. Now you see your mistake." As they sat waiting for dinner, Constance and Mrs. Baines on the sofa, and Samuel on the edge of the nearest rocking-chair, a small scuffling noise was heard outside the door which gave on the kitchen steps. The door yielded to pressure, and Fan rushed importantly in, deranging matters. Fan's nose had been hinting to her that she was behind the times, not up to date in the affairs of the household, and she had hurried from the kitchen to make inquiries. It occurred to her en route that she had been washed that morning. The spectacle of Mrs. Baines stopped her. She stood with her legs slightly outstretched, her nose lifted, her ears raking forward, her bright eyes blinking, and her tail undecided. "I was sure I'd never smelt anything like that before," she was saying to herself, as she stared at Mrs. Baines. And Mrs. Baines, staring at Fan, had a similar, though not the same, sentiment. The silence was terrible. Constance took on the mien of a culprit, and Sam had obviously lost his easy bearing of a man of the world. Mrs. Baines was merely thunderstruck. A dog! Suddenly Fan's tail began to wag more quickly, and then, having looked in vain for encouragement to her master and mistress, she gave one mighty spring and alighted in Mrs. Baines's lap. It was an aim she could not have missed. Constance emitted an "Oh, Fan!" of shocked terror, and Samuel betrayed his nervous tension by an involuntary movement. But Fan had settled down into that titanic lap as into heaven. It was a greater flattery than Mr. Povey's. "So your name's Fan," murmured Mrs. Baines, stroking the animal. "Oh, you are a dear." "Yes, isn't she?" said Constance, with inconceivable rapidity. The danger was past. Thus, without any explanation, Fan became an accepted fact. The next moment Maggie served the Yorkshire pudding. "Well, Maggie," said Mrs. Baines, "so you're going to get married this time. When is it?" "Sunday, ma'am." "And you leave here on Saturday?" "Yes, ma'am." "Well, I must have a talk with you before I go." During the dinner, not a word as to the signboard. Several times the conversation curved towards that signboard in the most alarming fashion, but invariably it curved away again, like a train from another train, when two trains are simultaneously leaving a station. Constance had frights so serious as to destroy her anxiety about the cookery. In the end she comprehended that her mother had adopted a silently disapproving attitude. Fan was socially very useful throughout the repast. After dinner Constance was on pins lest Samuel should light a cigar. She had not requested him not to do so, for though she was entirely sure of his affection, she had already learnt that a husband is possessed by a demon of contrariety, which often forces him to violate his higher feelings. However, Samuel did not light a cigar. He went off to superintend the shutting up of the shop, while Mrs. Baines chatted to Maggie and gave her £5 for a wedding present. Then Mr. Critchlow called to offer his salutations. A little before tea, Mrs. Baines announced that she would go out for a short walk by herself. "Where has she gone to?" smiled Samuel superiorly, as with Constance at the window he watched her turn down King Street towards the church. "I expect she's gone to look at father's grave," said Constance. "Oh," muttered Samuel apologetically. Constance was mistaken. Before reaching the church, Mrs. Baines deviated to the right, got into Broome Street, and thence by Acre Lane into Oldcastle Street, whose steep she climbed. Now, Oldcastle Street ends at the top of St. Luke's Square, and from the corner Mrs. Baines had an excellent view of the signboard. It being Thursday afternoon, scarce a soul was about. She returned to her daughters by the same extraordinary route, and said not a word on entering, but she was markedly cheerful. The wagonette came after tea, and Mrs. Baines made her final preparations to depart. The visit had proved a wonderful success. It would have been utterly perfect if Samuel had not marred it at the very door of the wagonette. Somehow he contrived to be talking of Christmas. Only a person of Samuel's native clumsiness would have mentioned Christmas in July. "You know you'll spend Christmas with us?" said he into the wagonette. "Indeed I shan't," replied Mrs. Baines. "Aunt Harriet and I will expect you at Axe. We've already settled that." Mr. Povey bridled. "Oh no," he protested, hurt by this summariness. Having had no relatives except his cousin the confectioner, for many years he had dreamt of at last establishing a family Christmas under his own roof, and the dream was dear to him. Mrs. Baines said nothing. "We couldn't possibly leave the shop," said Mr. Povey. "Nonsense," Mrs. Baines retorted, putting her lips together. "Christmas Day is a Monday." The wagonette, in starting, jerked her head towards the door, and set all her curls shaking. No white in those curls yet, scarcely a touch of grey. "I shall take good care we don't go there, anyway," Mr. Povey mumbled in his heat, half to himself and half to Constance. He had stained the brightness of the day. End of Book 2, Chapter 1. Book 2, Chapter 2 of The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain.
For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett.
Book 2. Constance. Chapter 2. Christmas and the Future. 1. Mr. Povey was playing a hymn tune on the harmonium, it having been decided that no one should go to chapel. Constance, in mourning, with a white apron over her dress, sat on a hassock in front of the fire, and near her, in a rocking chair, Mrs. Baines swayed very gently to and fro. The weather was extremely cold. Mr. Povey's mittened hands were blue and red, but, like many shopkeepers, he had apparently grown almost insensible to vagaries of temperature. Although the fire was immense and furious, its influence, owing to the fact that the mediaeval grate was designed to heat the flue rather than the room, seemed to die away at the borders of the fender. Constance could not have been much closer to it without being a salamander. The era of good old-fashioned Christmases, so agreeably picturesque for the poor, was not yet at an end. Yes, Samuel Povey had won the battle concerning the locus of the family Christmas, but he had received the help of a formidable ally, death. Mrs. Harriet Maddock had passed away, after an operation, leaving her house and her money to her sister. The solemn rite of her interment had deeply affected all the respectability of the town of Axe, where the late Mr. Maddock had been a figure of consequence. It had even shut up the shop in St. Luke's Square for a whole day. It was such a funeral as Aunt Harriet herself would have approved, a tremendous ceremonial which left on the crushed mind an ineffaceable, intricate impression of shiny cloth, crape, horses with arching necks and long manes, the drawl of parsons, cake, port, sighs, and Christian submission to the inscrutable decrees of Providence. Mrs. Baines had borne herself with unnatural calmness until the funeral was over, and then Constance perceived that the remembered mother of her girlhood existed no longer. For the majority of human souls it would have been easier to love a virtuous principle or a mountain than to love Aunt Harriet, who was assuredly less a woman than an institution. But Mrs. Baines had loved her, and she had been the one person to whom Mrs. Baines looked for support and guidance. When she died, Mrs. Baines paid the tribute of respect with the last hoarded remains of her proud fortitude, and weepingly confessed that the unconquerable had been conquered, the inexhaustible exhausted, and become old with whitening hair. She had persisted in her refusal to spend Christmas in Bursley, but both Constance and Samuel knew that the resistance was only formal. She soon yielded. When Constance's second new servant took it into her head to leave a week before Christmas, Mrs. Baines might have pointed out the finger of Providence at work again, and this time in her favour. But no, with amazing pliancy she suggested that she should bring over one of her own servants to tide Constance over Christmas. She was met with all the forms of loving solicitude, and she found that her daughter and son-in-law had turned out of the state bedroom in her favour. Intensely flattered by this attention, which was Mr. Povey's magnanimous idea, she nevertheless protested strongly. Indeed, she would not hear of it. "Now, mother, don't be silly," Constance had said firmly. "You don't expect us to be at all the trouble of moving back again, do you?" And Mrs. Baines had surrendered in tears. Thus had come Christmas. Perhaps it was fortunate that, the Axe servant being not quite the ordinary servant, but a benefactor where a benefactor was needed, both Constance and her mother thought it well to occupy themselves in household work, sparing the benefactor as much as possible. Hence Constance's white apron. "There he is," said Mr. Povey, still playing, but with his eye on the street. Constance sprang up eagerly. Then there was a knock on the door. Constance opened, and an icy blast swept into the room. The postman stood on the steps, his instrument for knocking, like a drumstick, in one hand, a large bundle of letters in the other, and a yawning bag across the pit of his stomach. "Merry Christmas, ma'am!" cried the postman, trying to keep warm by cheerfulness. Constance, taking the letters, responded, while Mr. Povey, playing the harmonium with his right hand, drew half a crown from his pocket with the left. "Here you are," he said, giving it to Constance, who gave it to the postman. Fan, who had been keeping her muzzle warm with the extremity of her tail on the sofa, jumped down to superintend the transaction. "Brrr!" vibrated Mr. Povey as Constance shut the door. "What lots!" Constance exclaimed, rushing to the fire. "Here, mother! Here, Sam!" The girl had resumed possession of the woman's body. Though the Baines family had few friends, sustained hospitality being little practised in those days, they had of course many acquaintances, and like other families they counted their Christmas cards as an Indian counts scalps. The tale was satisfactory. There were between 30 and 40 envelopes. Constance extracted Christmas cards rapidly, reading their contents aloud, and then propping them up on the mantelpiece. Mrs. Baines assisted. Fan dealt with the envelopes on the floor. Mr. Povey, to prove that his soul was above toys and gewgaws, continued to play the harmonium. "Oh, mother!" Constance murmured in a startled, hesitant voice, holding an envelope. "What is it, my chuck?" "It's—" The envelope was addressed to Mrs. and Miss Baines, in large, perpendicular, dashing characters, which Constance instantly recognised as Sophia's. The stamps were strange. The postmark Paris. Mrs. Baines leant forward and looked. "Open it, child," she said. The envelope contained an English Christmas card of a common type, a spray of holly with greetings, and on it was written: "I do hope this will reach you on Christmas morning. Fondest love." No signature nor address. Mrs. Baines took it with a trembling hand and adjusted her spectacles. She gazed at it a long time. "And it has done," she said, and wept. She tried to speak again, but not being able to command herself, held forth the card to Constance, and jerked her head in the direction of Mr. Povey. Constance rose and put the card on the keyboard of the harmonium. "Sophia," she whispered. Mr. Povey stopped playing. "Dear, dear!" he muttered. Fan, perceiving that nobody was interested in her feats, suddenly stood still. Mrs. Baines tried once more to speak, but could not. Then, her ringlets shaking beneath the band of her weeds, she found her feet, stepped to the harmonium, and with a movement almost convulsive, snatched the card from Mr. Povey and returned to her chair. Mr. Povey abruptly left the room, followed by Fan. Both the women were in tears, and he was tremendously surprised to discover a dangerous lump in his own throat. The beautiful and imperious vision of Sophia as she had left them, innocent, wayward, had swiftly risen up before him, and made even him a woman too. Yet he had never liked Sophia. The awful secret wound in the family pride revealed itself to him as never before, and he felt intensely the mother's tragedy, which she carried in her breast as Aunt Harriet had carried a cancer. At dinner he said suddenly to Mrs. Baines, who still wept: "Now, mother, you must cheer up, you know." "Yes, I must," she said quickly, and she did so. Neither Samuel nor Constance saw the card again. Little was said. There was nothing to say. As Sophia had given no address, she must still be ashamed of her situation. But she had thought of her mother and sister. She did not even know that Constance was married. What sort of place was Paris? To Bursley, Paris was nothing but the site of a great exhibition which had recently closed. Through the influence of Mrs. Baines, a new servant was found for Constance in a village near Axe, a raw, comely girl who had never been in a place. And through the post it was arranged that this innocent should come to the cave on the 31st of December. In obedience to the safe rule that servants should never be allowed to meet for the interchange of opinions, Mrs. Baines decided to leave with her own servant on the 30th. She would not be persuaded to spend the New Year in the square. On the 29th, poor Aunt Maria died all of a sudden in her cottage in Broome Street. Everybody was duly distressed,
and in particular Mrs. Baines' demeanour under this affliction showed the perfection of correctness. But she caused it to be understood that she should not remain for the funeral. Her nerves would be unequal to the ordeal, and moreover her servant must not stay to corrupt the new girl. Nor could Mrs. Baines think of sending her servant to Axe in advance, to spend several days in idle gossip with her colleague. This decision took the backbone out of Aunt Maria's funeral, which touched the extreme of modesty, a hearse and a one-horse coach. Mr. Povey was glad, because he happened to be very busy. An hour before his mother-in-law's departure, he came into the parlour with the proof of a poster. "What is that, Samuel?" asked Mrs. Baines, not dreaming of the blow that awaited her. "It's for my first annual sale," replied Mr. Povey with false tranquillity. Mrs. Baines merely tossed her head. Constance, happily for Constance, was not present at this final defeat of the old order. Had she been there, she would certainly not have known where to look.
2. 40 next birthday? Mr. Povey exclaimed one day, with an expression and in a tone that were at once mock serious and serious. This was on his 39th birthday. Constance was startled. She had, of course, been aware that they were getting older, but she had never realized the phenomenon. Though customers occasionally remarked that Mr. Povey was stouter, and though, when she helped him to measure himself for a new suit of clothes, the tape proved the fact, he had not changed for her. She knew that she too had become somewhat stouter, but for herself she remained exactly the same Constance. Only by recalling dates and by calculations could she really grasp that she had been married a little over 6 years, and not a little over 6 months. She had to admit that if Samuel would be 40 next birthday, she would be 27 next birthday. But he would not be a real 27, nor would Sam's 40 be a real 40, like other people's 27s and 40s. Not long since, she had been in the habit of regarding a man of 40 as senile, as practically in his grave. She reflected, and the more she reflected, the more clearly she saw that, after all, the almanacs had not lied. Look at Fan. Yes, it must be 5 years since the memorable morning when doubt first crossed the minds of Samuel and Constance as to Fan's moral principles. Samuel's enthusiasm for dogs was equalled by his ignorance of the dangers to which a young female of temperament may be exposed, and he was much disturbed as doubt developed into certainty. Fan, indeed, was the one being who did not suffer from shock, and who had no fears as to the results. The animal, having a pure mind, was bereft of modesty. Sundry enormities had she committed, but none to rank with this one. The result was 4 quadrupeds, recognizable as fox terriers. Mr. Povey breathed again. Fan had had more luck than she deserved, for the result might have been simply anything. Her owners forgave her, and disposed of these fruits of iniquity, and then married her lawfully to a husband who was so high up in the world that he could demand a dowry. And now Fan was a grandmother, with fixed ideas and habits, and a son in the house, and various grandchildren scattered over the town. Fan was a sedate and disillusioned dog. She knew the world as it was, and in learning it she had taught her owners above a bit. Then there was Maggie Hollins. Constance could still vividly recall the self-consciousness with which she had one day received Maggie and the heir of the Hollinses, but it was a long time ago. After staggering half the town by the production of this infant, of which she nearly died, Maggie allowed the angels to waft it away to heaven, and everybody said that she ought to be very thankful at her age. Old women dug up out of their minds forgotten histories of the eccentricities of the goddess Lucina. Mrs. Baines was most curiously interested. She talked freely to Constance, and Constance began to see what an incredible town Bursley had always been, and she never suspected it. Maggie was now the mother of other children, and the draggled lame mistress of a drunken home, and looked 60. Despite her prophecy, her husband had conserved his habits, The Povies ate all the fish they could, and sometimes more than they enjoyed, because on his sober days Hollins invariably started his round at the shop, and Constance had to buy for Maggie's sake. The worst of the worthless husband was that he seldom failed to be cheery and polite. He never missed asking after the health of Mrs. Baines, and when Constance replied that her mother was pretty well considering, but that she would not come over to Bursley again until the Axe railway was opened, as she could not stand the drive, he would shake his grey head and be sympathetically gloomy for an instant. All these changes in 6 years! The almanacs were in the right of it. But nothing had happened to her. Gradually she had obtained a sure ascendancy over her mother, yet without seeking it, merely as the outcome of time's influences on her and on her mother respectively. Gradually she had gained skill and use in the management of her household and her share of the shop, so that these machines ran smoothly and effectively, and a sudden contretemps no longer frightened her. Gradually she had constructed a chart of Samuel's individuality, with the submerged rocks and perilous currents all carefully marked, so that she could now voyage unalarmed in those seas. But nothing happened, unless their visits to Buxton could be called happenings. Decidedly the visit to Buxton was the one little hill that rose out of the level plain of the year. They had formed the annual habit of going to Buxton for 10 days. They had a way of saying, "Yes, we always go to Buxton. We went there for our honeymoon, you know." They had become confirmed Buxtonites, with views concerning St. Aaron's Terrace, the Broad Walk, and Peel's Cavern. They could not dream of deserting their Buxton. It was the sole possible resort. Was it not the highest town in England? Well, then. They always stayed at the same lodgings, and grew to be special favourites of the landlady, who whispered of them to all her other guests as having come to her house for their honeymoon, and as never missing a year, and as being most respectable, superior people in quite a large way of business. Each year they walked out of Buxton station behind their luggage on a truck, full of joy and pride, because they knew all the landmarks, and the lie of all the streets, and which were the best shops. At the beginning, the notion of leaving the shop to hired custody had seemed almost fantastic, and the preparations for absence had been very complicated. Then it was that Miss Insull had detached herself from the other young lady assistants as a creature who could be absolutely trusted. Miss Insull was older than Constance. She had a bad complexion, and she was not clever, but she was one of your reliable ones. The 6 years had witnessed the slow, steady rise of Miss Insull. Her employers said, "Miss Insull," in a tone quite different from that in which they said, "Miss Hawkins," or "Miss Dadd." Miss Insull meant the end of a discussion. "Better tell Miss Insull." "Miss Insull will see to that." "I shall ask Miss Insull." Miss Insull slept in the house 10 nights every year. Miss Insull had been called into consultation when it was decided to engage a fourth hand in the shape of an apprentice. Trade had improved to the point of excellence. It was now admitted to be good, a rare honour for trade. The coal mining boom was at its height, and colliers, in addition to getting drunk, were buying American organs and expensive bull terriers. Often they would come to the shop to purchase cloth for coats for their dogs, and they would have good cloth. Mr. Povey did not like this. One day a butty chose for his dog the best cloth of Mr. Povey's shop at 12 shillings a yard. "Will you make it up? I've gotten the measurements," asked the collier. "No, I won't," said Mr. Povey hotly, "and what's more, I won't sell you the cloth either. Cloth at 12 shillings a yard on a dog's back, indeed! I'll thank you to get out of my shop." The incident became historic in the square. It finally established that Mr. Povey was a worthy son-in-law and a solid and successful man. It vindicated the old pre-eminence of Baineses. Some surprise was expressed that Mr. Povey showed no desire nor tendency towards entering the public life of the town. But he never would, though a keen satirical critic of the local board in private, and at the chapel he remained a simple private worshipper, refusing stewardships and trusteeships. 3. Was Constance happy? Of course there was always something on her mind, something that had to be dealt with, either in the shop or in the house.
something to employ all the skill and experience which she had acquired. Her life had much in it of laborious tedium, tedium never ending and monotonous, and both she and Samuel worked consistently hard, rising early, pushing forward, as the phrase ran, and going to bed early from sheer fatigue, week after week and month after month, as season changed imperceptibly into season. In June and July it would happen to them occasionally to retire before the last sliver of dusk was out of the sky. They would lie in bed and talk placidly of their daily affairs. There would be a noise in the street below. "Vault's closing," Samuel would say, and yawn. "Yes, it's quite late," Constance would say, and the Swiss clock would rapidly strike 11 on its coil of resonant wire. And then, just before she went to sleep, Constance might reflect upon her destiny, as even the busiest and smoothest women do, and she would decide that it was kind. Her mother's gradual decline and lonely life at Axe saddened her. The cards which came now and then at extremely long intervals from Sophia had been the cause of more sorrow than joy. The naive ecstasies of her girlhood had long since departed, the price paid for experience and self-possession and a true vision of things. The vast inherent melancholy of the universe did not exempt her. But as she went to sleep, she would be conscious of a vague contentment. The basis of this contentment was the fact that she and Samuel comprehended and esteemed each other, and made allowances for each other. Their characters had been tested, and had stood the test. Affection, love, was not to them a salient phenomenon in their relations. Habit had inevitably dulled its glitter. It was like a flavouring, scarce remarked. But had it been absent, how they would have turned from that dish! Samuel never, or hardly ever, set himself to meditate upon the problem of whether or not life had come up to his expectations. But he had at times strange sensations which he did not analyse, and which approached nearer to ecstasy than any feeling of Constance's. Thus, when he was in one of his dark furies, molten within and black without, the sudden thought of his wife's unalterable benignant calm, which nothing could overthrow, might strike him into a wondering cold. For him she was astoundingly feminine. She would put flowers on the mantelpiece, and then, hours afterwards, in the middle of a meal, ask him unexpectedly what he thought of her garden. And he gradually divined that a perfunctory reply left her unsatisfied. She wanted a genuine opinion. A genuine opinion mattered to her. Fancy calling flowers on a mantelpiece a garden! How charming, how childlike! Then she had a way on Sunday mornings, when she descended to the parlour, all ready for chapel, of shutting the door at the foot of the stairs with a little bang, shaking herself and turning round swiftly as if for his inspection, as if saying, "Well, what about this? Will this do?" A phenomenon always associated in his mind with the smell of kid gloves. Invariably she asked him about the colours and cut of her dresses. Would he prefer this or that? He could not take such questions seriously, until one day he happened to hint, merely hint, that he was not a thorough-going admirer of a certain new dress. It was her first new dress after the definite abandonment of crinolines. She never wore it again. He thought she was not serious at first, and remonstrated against the joke being carried too far. She said, "It's not a bit of use you talking. I shan't wear it again." And then he so far appreciated her seriousness as to refrain, by discretion, from any comment. The incident affected him for days. It flattered him, it thrilled him, but it baffled him. Strange that a woman subject to such caprices should be so sagacious, capable, and utterly reliable as Constance was. For the practical and common sense side of her eternally compelled his admiration. The first example of it, her insistence that the simultaneous absence of both of them from the shop for half an hour or an hour twice a day would not mean the immediate downfall of the business, had remained in his mind ever since. Had she not been obstinate, in her benevolent way, against the old superstition which he had acquired from his employers, they might have been eating separately to that day. Then her handling of her mother, during the months of the siege of Paris, when Mrs. Baines was convinced that her sinful daughter was in hourly danger of death, had been extraordinarily fine, he considered, and the sequel, a card for Constance's birthday, had completely justified her attitude. Sometimes some blundering fool would jovially exclaim to them, "What about that baby?" Or a woman would remark quietly, "I often feel sorry you've no children." And they would answer that really they did not know what they would do if there was a baby, what with the shop and one thing and another, and they were quite sincere.
4. It is remarkable what a little thing will draw even the most regular and serious people from the deep groove of their habits. One morning in March, a bone shaker, an affair on two equal wooden wheels, joined by a bar of iron, in the middle of which was a wooden saddle, disturbed the gravity of St. Luke's Square. True, it was probably the first bone shaker that had ever attacked the gravity of St. Luke's Square. It came out of the shop of Daniel Povey, the confectioner and baker, and Samuel Povey's celebrated cousin, in Bolton Terrace. Bolton Terrace formed nearly a right angle with the Baines premises, and at the corner of the angle Wedgwood Street and King Street left the square. The bone shaker was brought forth by Dick Povey, the only son of Daniel, now aged 11 years, under the superintendence of his father, and the square soon perceived that Dick had a natural talent for breaking in an untrained bone shaker. After a few attempts he could remain on the back of the machine for at least 10 yards, and his feats had the effect of endowing St. Luke's Square with the attractiveness of a circus. Samuel Povey watched with candid interest from the ambush of his door, while the unfortunate lady assistants, though aware of the performance that was going on, dared not stare from the stove. Samuel was tremendously tempted to sally out boldly and chat with his cousin about the toy. He had surely a better right to do so than any other tradesman in the square, since he was of the family, but his diffidence prevented him from moving. Presently Daniel Povey and Dick went to the top of the square with the machine, opposite Hall's, and Dick, being carefully installed in the saddle, essayed to descend the gentle paven slopes of the square. He failed time after time. The machine had an astonishing way of turning round, running uphill, and then lying calmly on its side. At this point of Dick's life history, every shop door in the square was occupied by an audience. At last the bone shaker displayed less unwillingness to obey, and lo, in a moment Dick was riding down the square, and the spectators held their breath as if he had been Blondin crossing Niagara. Every second he ought to have fallen off, but he contrived to keep upright. Already he had accomplished 20 yards, 30 yards. It was a miracle that he was performing. The transit continued, and seemed to occupy hours, and then a faint hope rose in the breast of the watchers that the prodigy might arrive at the bottom of the square. His speed was increasing with his knack, but the square was enormous, boundless. Samuel Povey gazed at the approaching phenomenon as a bird at a serpent, with bulging, beady eyes. The child's speed went on increasing, and his path grew straighter. Yes, he would arrive. He would do it. Samuel Povey involuntarily lifted one leg in his nervous tension. And now the hope that Dick would arrive became a fear, as his pace grew still more rapid. Everybody lifted one leg and gaped, and the intrepid child surged on, and finally, victorious, crashed into the pavement in front of Samuel at the rate of quite 6 miles an hour. Samuel picked him up unscathed, and somehow this picking up of Dick invested Samuel with importance, gave him a share in the glory of the feat itself. Daniel Povey came running and joyous. "Not bad for a start, eh?" exclaimed the great Daniel. Though by no means a simple man, his pride in his offspring sometimes made him a little naive. Father and son explained the machine to Samuel, Dick incessantly repeating the exceedingly strange truth that if you felt you were falling to your right, you must turn to your right, and vice versa. Samuel found himself suddenly admitted, as it were, to the inner fellowship of the bone shaker, exalted above the rest of the square. In another adventure more thrilling events occurred. The fair-haired Dick was one of those dangerous, frenzied madcaps who are born without fear.
The secret of the machine had been revealed to him in his recent transit, and he was silently determining to surpass himself. Precariously balanced, he descended the square again, frowning hard, his teeth set, and actually managed to swerve into King Street. Constance, in the parlour, saw an incomprehensible winged thing fly past the window. The cousins Povey sounded an alarm and protest, and ran in pursuit, for the gradient of King Street is, in the strict sense, steep. Half way down King Street, Dick was travelling at 20 miles an hour, and heading straight for the church, as though he meant to disestablish it and perish. The main gate of the churchyard was open, and that affrighting child, with a lunatic's luck, whizzed safely through the portals into God's acre. The cousins Povey discovered him lying in a green grave, clothed in pride. His first words were, "Dad, did you pick my cap up?" The symbolism of the amazing ride did not escape the square. Indeed, it was much discussed. This incident led to a friendship between the cousins. They formed the habit of meeting in the square for a chat. The meetings were the subject of comment, for Samuel's relations with the greater Daniel had always been of the most distant. It was understood that Samuel disapproved of Mrs. Daniel Povey even more than the majority of people disapproved of her. Mrs. Daniel Povey, however, was away from home. Probably, had she not been, Samuel would not even have gone to the length of joining Daniel on the neutral ground of the open square. But having once broken the ice, Samuel was glad to be on terms of growing intimacy with his cousin. The friendship flattered him, for Daniel, despite his wife, was a figure in a world larger than Samuel's. Moreover, it consecrated his position as the equal of no matter what tradesman, apprentice though he had been. And also, he genuinely liked and admired Daniel, rather to his own astonishment. Every one liked Daniel Povey. He was a favourite among all ranks. The leading confectioner, a member of the local board, and a sidesman at St. Luke's, he was, and had been for 25 years, very prominent in the town. He was a tall, handsome man, with a trimmed greying beard, a jolly smile, and a flashing dark eye. His good humour seemed to be permanent. He had dignity without the slightest stiffness. He was welcomed by his equals, and frankly adored by his inferiors. He ought to have been chief bailiff, for he was rich enough. But there intervened a mysterious obstacle between Daniel Povey and the supreme honour, a scarcely tangible impediment, which could not be definitely stated. He was capable, honest, industrious, successful, and an excellent speaker. And if he did not belong to the austerer section of society, if, for example, he thought nothing of dropping into the Tiger for a glass of beer, or of using an oath occasionally, or of telling a facetious story, well, in a busy, broad-minded town of 30,000 inhabitants, such proclivities are no bar whatever to perfect esteem. But how is one to phrase it without wronging Daniel Povey? He was entirely moral. His views were unexceptionable. The truth is that for the ruling classes of Bursley, Daniel Povey was just a little too fanatical a worshipper of the god Pan. He was one of the remnant who had kept alive the great Pan tradition from the days of the Regency through the vast, arid, Victorian expanse of years. The flighty character of his wife was regarded by many as a judgment upon him for the robust Rabelaisianism of his more private conversation, for his frank interest in, and his eternal preoccupation with, aspects of life and human activity which, though essential to the divine purpose, are not openly recognised as such, even by Daniel Poveys. It was not a question of his conduct, it was a question of the cast of his mind. If it did not explain his friendship with the rector of St. Luke's, it explained his departure from the primitive Methodist connection to which the Poveys as a family had belonged since primitive Methodism was created in Turnhill in 1807. Daniel Povey had a way of assuming that every male was boiling over with interest in the sacred cult of Pan. The assumption, though sometimes causing inconvenience at first, usually conquered by virtue of its inherent truthfulness. Thus it fell out with Samuel. Samuel had not suspected that Pan had silken cords to draw him. He had always averted his eyes from the god, that is to say, within reason. Yet now Daniel, on perhaps a couple of fine mornings a week, in full square, with Fan sitting behind on the cold stones, and Mr. Critchlow ironic in his door in a long white apron, would entertain Samuel Povey for half an hour with Pan's most intimate lore, and Samuel Povey would not blench. He would, on the contrary, stand up to Daniel like a little man, and pretend with all his might to be, potentially, a perfect archpriest of the god. Daniel taught him a lot, turned over the page of life for him, as it were, and showing the reverse side, seemed to say, "You were missing all that." Samuel glanced upwards at the handsome long nose and rich lips of his elder cousin, so experienced, so agreeable, so renowned, so esteemed, so philosophic, and admitted to himself that he had lived to the age of 40 in a state of comparative boobyism. And then he would gaze downwards at the faint patch of flour on Daniel's right leg, and conceive that life was, and must be, life. Not many weeks after his initiation into the cult, he was startled by Constance's preoccupied face one evening. Now, a husband of 6 years' standing, to whom it has not happened to become a father, is not easily startled by such a face as Constance wore. Years ago he had frequently been startled, had frequently lived in suspense for a few days, but he had long since grown impervious to these alarms. And now he was startled again, but as a man may be startled who is not altogether surprised at being startled. And 7 endless days passed, and Samuel and Constance glanced at each other like guilty things whose secret refuses to be kept. Then 3 more days passed, and another 3. Then Samuel Povey remarked in a firm, masculine, fact-fronting tone, "Oh, there's no doubt about it." And they glanced at each other like conspirators who have lighted a fuse and cannot take refuge in flight. Their eyes said continually, with a delicious and enchanting mixture of ingenuous modesty and fearful joy, "Well, we've gone and done it." There it was, the incredible, incomprehensible future coming. Samuel had never correctly imagined the manner of its heralding. He had imagined, in his early simplicity, that one day Constance, blushing, might put her mouth to his ear and whisper something positive. It had not occurred in the least like that. But things are so obstinately, so incurably unsentimental. "I think we ought to drive over and tell Mother on Sunday," said Constance. His impulse was to reply, in his grand off-hand style, "Oh, a letter will do." But he checked himself and said, with careful deference, "You think that will be better than writing?" All was changed. He braced every fibre to meet destiny, and to help Constance meet it. The weather threatened on Sunday. He went to Axe without Constance. His cousin drove him there in a dog-cart, and he announced that he should walk home, as the exercise would do him good. During the drive, Daniel, in whom he had not confided, chattered as usual, and Samuel pretended to listen with the same attitude as usual. But secretly he despised Daniel, for a man who has got something not of the first importance on the brain. His perspective was truer than Daniel's. He walked home, as he had decided, over the wavy moorland of the county dreaming in the heart of England. Night fell on him in mid-career, and he was tired, but the earth, as it whirled through naked space, whirled up the moon for him, and he pressed on at a good speed. A wind from Arabia wandering cooled his face, and at last, over the brow of Toft End, he saw suddenly the 5 Towns, a twinkle on their little hills down in the vast amphitheatre. And one of those lamps was Constance's lamp, one somewhere. He lived then. He entered into the shadow of nature. The mysteries made him solemn. What? A bone shaker? His cousin? And then this! "Well, I'm damned! Well, I'm damned!" he kept repeating. He who never swore. End of chapter 2. Chapter 2 of The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett.
Book 2. Constance. Chapter 3 Cyril 1. Constance stood at the large, many-paned window in the parlour. She was stouter. Although always plump, her figure had been comely, with a neat, well-marked waist. But now the shapeliness had gone, the waistline no longer existed, and there were no more crinolines to create it artificially. An observer, not under the charm of her face, might have been excused for calling her fat and lumpy. The face, grave, kind, and expectant, with its radiant fresh cheeks and the rounded softness of its curves, atoned for the figure. She was nearly 29 years of age. It was late in October. In Wedgwood Street, next to Bolton Terrace, all the little brown houses had been pulled down to make room for a palatial covered market, whose foundations were then being dug. This destruction exposed a vast area of sky to the north-east. A great dark cloud with an untidy edge rose massively out of the depths, and curtained off the tender blue of the approaching dusk, while in the west, behind Constance, the sun was setting in calm and gorgeous melancholy on the Thursday hush of the town. It was one of those afternoons which gather up all the sadness of the moving earth and transform it into beauty. Samuel Povey turned the corner from Wedgwood Street and crossed King Street obliquely to the front door, which Constance opened. He seemed tired and anxious. "Well?" demanded Constance as he entered. "She's no better. There's no getting away from it. She's worse. I should have stayed, only I knew you'd be worrying, so I caught the 3:50.
How is that Mrs. Gilchrist shaping as a nurse?"
"She's very good," said Samuel with conviction. "Very good." "What a blessing! I suppose you didn't happen to see the doctor?" "Yes, I did." "What did he say to you?" Samuel gave a deprecating gesture. "Didn't say anything particular. With dropsy at that stage, you know." Constance had returned to the window, her expectancy apparently unappeased. "I don't like the look of that cloud," she murmured. "What, are they out still?" Samuel inquired, taking off his overcoat. "Here they are!" cried Constance. Her features suddenly transfigured, she sprang to the door, pulled it open, and descended the steps. A perambulator was being rapidly pushed up the slope by a breathless girl. "Amy," Constance gently protested, "I told you not to venture far." "I hurried all I could, mum, soon as I seed that cloud," the girl puffed, with the air of one who is seriously thankful to have escaped a great disaster. Constance dived into the recesses of the perambulator and extracted from its cocoon the centre of the universe, and scrutinized him with quiet passion, and then rushed with him into the house, though not a drop of rain had yet fallen. "Precious!" exclaimed Amy in ecstasy, her young virginal eyes following him till he disappeared. Then she wheeled away the perambulator, which now had no more value nor interest than an eggshell. It was necessary to take it right round to the Broome Street yard entrance, past the front of the closed shop. Constance sat down on the horsehair sofa and hugged and kissed her prize before removing his bonnet. "Here's Daddy," she said to him, as if imparting strange and rapturous tidings. "Here's Daddy come back from hanging up his coat in the passage. Daddy rubbing his hands." And then, with a swift transition of voices and features, "Do look at him, Sam." Samuel, preoccupied, stooped forward. "Oh, you little scoundrel! Oh, you little scoundrel!" he greeted the baby, advancing his finger towards the baby's nose. The baby, who had hitherto maintained a passive indifference to external phenomena, lifted elbows and toes, blew bubbles from his tiny mouth, and stared at the finger with the most ravishing roguish smile, as though saying, "I know that great sticking out limb, and there is a joke about it which no one but me can see, and which is my secret joy that you shall never share." "Tea ready?" Samuel asked, resuming his gravity and his ordinary pose. "You must give the girl time to take her things off," said Constance. "We'll have the table drawn away from the fire, and baby can lie on his shawl on the hearthrug while we're having tea." And then to the baby in rapture, "And play with his toys, all his nice, nice toys." "You know Miss Insull is staying for tea?" Constance.
her head bent over the baby, who formed a white patch on her comfortable brown frock, nodded without speaking. Samuel Povey, walking to and fro, began to enter into the details of his hasty journey to Axe. Old Mrs. Baines, having beheld her grandson, was preparing to quit this world. Never again would she exclaim in her brusque tone of genial ruthlessness, "Fiddlesticks!" The situation was very difficult and distressing, for Constance could not leave her baby, and she would not, until the last urgency, run the risks of a journey with him to Axe. He was being weaned. In any case, Constance could not have undertaken the nursing of her mother. A nurse had to be found. Mr. Povey had discovered one in the person of Mrs. Gilchrist, the second wife of a farmer at Malpas in Cheshire, whose first wife had been a sister of the late John Baines. All the credit of Mrs. Gilchrist was due to Samuel Povey. Mrs. Baines fretted seriously about Sophia, who had given no sign of life for a very long time. Mr. Povey went to Manchester and ascertained definitely from the relatives of Scales that nothing was known of the pair. He did not go to Manchester especially on this errand. About once in 3 weeks, on Tuesdays, he had to visit the Manchester warehouses, but the tracking of Scales' relative cost him so much trouble and time that, curiously, he came to believe he had gone to Manchester one Tuesday for no other end. Although he was very busy indeed in the shop, he flew over to Axe and back whenever he possibly could, to the neglect of his affairs. He was glad to do all that was in his power. Even if he had not done it graciously, his sensitive, tyrannic conscience would have forced him to do it. But nevertheless he felt rather virtuous, and worry and fatigue and loss of sleep intensified this sense of virtue. "So that if there's any sudden change they will telegraph," he finished to Constance. She raised her head. The words, clinching what had led up to them, drew her from her dream, and she saw for the moment her mother in an agony. "But you surely don't mean—" she began, trying to disperse the painful vision as unjustified by the facts. "My dear girl," said Samuel, with his head singing and hot eyes, and a consciousness of high tension in every nerve of his body, "I simply mean that if there's any sudden change they will telegraph." While they had tea, Samuel sitting opposite to his wife, and Miss Insull nearly against the wall, owing to the moving of the table, the baby rolled about on the hearthrug, which had been covered with a large soft woollen shawl, originally the property of his great-grandmother. He had no cares, no responsibilities. The shawl was so vast that he could not clearly distinguish objects beyond its confines. On it lay an india-rubber ball, an india-rubber doll, a rattle, and fan. He vaguely recollected all 4 items with their respective properties. The fire was also an old friend. He had occasionally tried to touch it, but a high bright fence always came in between. For 10 months he had never spent a day without making experiments on this shifting universe in which he alone remained firm and stationary. The experiments were chiefly conducted out of idle amusement, but he was serious on the subject of food. Lately the behaviour of the universe in respect to his food had somewhat perplexed him, had indeed annoyed him. However, he was of a forgetful, happy disposition, and so long as the universe continued to fulfil its sole end as a machinery for the satisfaction, somehow, of his imperious desires, he was not inclined to remonstrate. He gazed at the flames and laughed because he had laughed. He pushed the ball away and wriggled after it, and captured it with the assurance of practice. He tried to swallow the doll, and it was not until he had tried several times to swallow it that he remembered the failure of previous efforts, and philosophically desisted. He rolled with a fearful shock, arms and legs in air, against the mountainous flank of that mammoth fan, and clutched at Fan's ear. The whole mass of Fan upheaved and vanished from his view, and was instantly forgotten by him. He seized the doll and tried to swallow it, and repeated the exhibition of his skill with the ball. Then he saw the fire again and laughed. And so he existed for centuries. No responsibilities, no appetites, and the shawl was vast. Terrific operations went on over his head. Giants moved to and fro. Great vessels were carried off, and great books were brought, and deep voices rumbled regularly in the spaces beyond the shawl. but he remained oblivious. At last he became aware that a face was looking down at his. He recognized it, and immediately an uncomfortable sensation in his stomach disturbed him. He tolerated it for 50 years or so, and then he gave a little cry. Life had resumed its seriousness. "Black alpaca, B quality, width 20, TA 22 yards," Miss Insull read out of a great book. She and Mr. Povey were checking stock. And Mr. Povey responded: "Black alpaca, B quality, width 20, TA 20 yards. It wants 10 minutes yet." He glanced at the clock. "Does it?" said Constance, well knowing that it wanted 10 minutes. The baby did not guess that a high invisible god named Samuel Povey, whom nothing escaped and who could do everything at once, was controlling his universe from an inconceivable distance. On the contrary, the baby was crying to himself, "There is no God." His weaning had reached the stage at which a baby really does not know what will happen next. The annoyance had begun exactly 3 months after his first tooth, such being the rule of the gods, and it had grown more and more disconcerting. No sooner did he accustom himself to a new phenomenon than it mysteriously ceased, and an old one took its place, which he had utterly forgotten. This afternoon his mother nursed him, but not until she had foolishly attempted to divert him from the seriousness of life by means of gewgaws of which he was sick. Still, once at her rich breast, he forgave and forgot all. He preferred her simple, natural breast to more modern inventions, and he had no shame, no modesty, nor had his mother. It was an indecent carouse at which his father and Miss Insull had to assist. But his father had shame. His father would have preferred that, as Miss Insull had kindly offered to stop and work on Thursday afternoon, and as the shop was chilly, the due rotation should have brought the bottle round at 5:30, and not the mother's breast. He was a self-conscious parent, rather apologetic to the world, rather apt to stand off and pretend that he had nothing to do with the affair, and he genuinely disliked that anybody should witness the intimate scene of his wife feeding his baby, especially Miss Insull, that prim, dark, moustached spinster. He would not have called it an outrage on Miss Insull to force her to witness the scene, but his idea approached within sight of the word. Constance blandly offered herself to the child with the unconscious primitive savagery of a young mother, and as the baby fed, thoughts of her own mother flitted to and fro ceaselessly, like vague shapes over the deep sea of content which filled her mind. This illness of her mother's was abnormal, and the baby was now, for the first time perhaps, entirely normal in her consciousness. The baby was something which could be disturbed, not something which did disturb. What a change! What a change that had seemed impossible until its full accomplishment! For months before the birth she had glimpsed at nights and in other silent hours the tremendous upset. She had not allowed herself to be silly in advance. By temperament she was too sagacious, too well balanced for that. But she had fitful instants of terror, when solid ground seemed to sink away from her, and imagination shook at what faced her. Instants only. Usually she could play the comedy of sensible calmness to almost perfection. Then the appointed time drew nigh, and still she smiled, and Samuel smiled, but the preparations, meticulous, intricate, revolutionary, belied their smiles. The intense resolve to keep Mrs. Baines, by methods scrupulous or unscrupulous, away from Bursley until all was over, belied their smiles. And then the first pains, sharp, shocking, cruel, heralds of torture, but when they had withdrawn she smiled again, palely. Then she was in bed, full of the sensation that the whole house was inverted and disorganized hopelessly, and the doctor came into the room. She smiled at the doctor apologetically, foolishly, as if saying, "We all come to it. Here I am." She was calm without. Oh, but what a prey of abject fear within! "I am at the edge of the precipice," her thought ran. "In a moment I shall be over." And then the pains, not the heralds, but the shattering army, endless, increasing in terror as they thundered across her. Yet she could think quite clearly. "Now I'm in the middle of it. This is it, the horror that I've not dared to look at. My life's in the balance. I may never get up again. All has at last come to pass. It seemed as if it would never come, as if this thing could not happen to me. But at last it has come to pass. Ah, someone put the twisted end of a towel into her hand again. She had loosed it, and she pulled enough to break cables. And then she shrieked. It was for pity. It was for someone to help her, at any rate to take notice of her. She was dying, her soul was leaving her, and she was alone, panic-stricken, in the midst of a cataclysm 1,000 times surpassing all that she had imagined of sickening horror. "I cannot endure this," she thought passionately. "It is impossible that I should be asked to endure this." And then she wept, beaten, terrorised, smashed and riven. No common sense now, no wise calmness now, no self-respect now. Why, not even a woman now. Nothing but a kind of animalised victim. And then the supreme endless spasm, during which she gave up the ghost and bade good-bye to her very self. She was lying quite comfortable in the soft bed, idle, silly, happiness forming like a thin crust over the lava of her anguish and her fright, and by her side was the soul that had fought its way out of her ruthlessly, the secret disturber revealed to the light of morning. Curious to look at, not like any baby that she had ever seen, red, creased, brutish, but for some reason that she did not examine, she folded it in an immense tenderness. Sam was by the bed, away from her eyes. She was so comfortable and silly that she could not move her head, nor even ask him to come round to her eyes. She had to wait till he came. In the afternoon the doctor returned, and astounded her by saying that hers had been an ideal confinement. She was too weary to rebuke him for a senseless, blind, callous old man, but she knew what she knew. "No one will ever guess," she thought. "No one can guess what I've been through. Talk as you like. I know now." Gradually she had resumed cognizance of her household, perceiving that it was demoralised from top to bottom, and that when the time came to begin upon it, she would not be able to settle where to begin, even supposing that the baby were not there to monopolise her attention. The task appalled her. Then she wanted to get up. Then she got up. What a blow to self-confidence! She went back to bed like a little scared rabbit to its hole, glad to be on the soft pillows again. She said, "Yet the time must come when I shall be downstairs, and walking about and meeting people, and cooking, and superintending the millinery." Well, it did come, except that she had to renounce the millinery to Miss Insull. But it was not the same. No, different. The baby pushed everything else on to another plane. He was a terrific intruder. Not 1 minute of her old daily life was left. He made no compromise whatever. If she turned away her gaze from him, he might pop off into eternity and leave her. And now she was calmly and sensibly giving him suck in presence of Miss Insull. She was used to his importance, to the fragility of his organism, to waking twice every night, to being fat. She was strong again. The convulsive twitching that for 6 months had worried her repose had quite disappeared. The state of being a mother was normal, and the baby was so normal that she could not conceive the house without him. All in 10 months. When the baby was installed in his cot for the night, she came downstairs and found Miss Insull and Samuel still working, and harder than ever, but at addition sums now. She sat down, leaving the door open at the foot of the stairs. She had embroidery in hand, a cap, and while Miss Insull and Samuel combined pounds, shillings, and pence, whispering at great speed, she bent over the delicate, intimate, wasteful handiwork, drawing the needle with slow exactitude. Then she would raise her head and listen. "Excuse me," said Miss Insull, "I think I hear baby crying." "And 2 are 8, and 3 are 11. He must cry," said Mr. Povey rapidly, without looking up. The baby's parents did not make a practice of discussing their domestic existence, even with Miss Insull, but Constance had to justify herself as a mother. "I've made perfectly sure he's comfortable," said Constance. "He's only crying because he fancies he's neglected, and we think he can't begin too early to learn." "How right you are," said Miss Insull. 2 and carry 3. That distant, feeble, querulous, pitiful cry continued obstinately. It continued for 30 minutes. Constance could not proceed with her work. The cry disintegrated her will, dissolved her hard sagacity. Without a word she crept upstairs, having carefully deposed the cap on her rocking chair. Mr. Povey hesitated a moment, and then bounded up after her, startling Fan. He shut the door on Miss Insull, but Fan was too quick for him. He saw Constance with her hand on the bedroom door. "My dear girl," he protested, holding himself in, "now what are you going to do?" "I'm just listening," said Constance. "Do be reasonable and come downstairs." He spoke in a low voice, scarcely masking his nervous irritation, and tiptoed along the corridor towards her, and up the 2 steps past the gas burner. Fan followed, wagging her tail, expectant. "Suppose he's not well?" Constance suggested. "Pshaw!" Mr. Povey exclaimed contemptuously. "You remember what happened last night, and what you said." They argued, subduing their tones to the false semblance of goodwill. There, in the closeness of the corridor, Fan, deceived, ceased to wag her tail, and then trotted away. The baby's cry behind the door rose to a mysterious, despairing howl, which had such an effect on Constance's heart that she should have walked through fire to reach the baby. But Mr. Povey's will held her, and she rebelled, angry, hurt, resentful. Common sense, the ideal of mutual forbearance, had winged away from that excited pair. It would have assuredly ended in a quarrel, with Samuel glaring at her in black fury from the other side of a bottomless chasm, had not Miss Insull most surprisingly burst up the stairs. Mr. Povey turned to face her, swallowing his emotion. "A telegram," said Miss Insull. "The postmaster brought it down himself." "What, Mr. Derry?" asked Samuel, opening the telegram with an affectation of majesty. "Yes. He said it was too late for delivery by rights, but as it seemed very important—" Samuel scanned it, and nodded gravely, then gave it to his wife. Tears came into her eyes. "I'll get Cousin Daniel to drive me over at once," said Samuel, master of himself and of the situation. "Wouldn't it be better to hire?" Constance suggested. She had a prejudice against Daniel. Mr. Povey shook his head. "He offered," he replied. "I can't refuse his offer." "Put your thick overcoat on, dear," said Constance in a dream, descending with him. "I hope it isn't—" Miss Insull stopped. "Yes, it is, Miss Insull," said Samuel deliberately. In less than a minute he was gone. Constance ran upstairs, but the cry had ceased. She turned the doorknob softly, slowly, and crept into the chamber. A nightlight made large shadows among the heavy mahogany and the crimson tasselled rep in the close curtained room, and between the bed and the ottoman, on which lay Samuel's newly bought family Bible, the cot loomed in the shadows. She picked up the nightlight and stole round the bed. Yes, he had decided to fall asleep. The hazard of death afar off had just defeated his devilish obstinacy. Fate had bested him. How marvellously soft and delicate that tear-stained cheek! How frail that tiny, tiny clenched hand! In Constance, grief and joy were mystically united.
2. The drawing-room was full of visitors in frocks of ceremony. The old drawing-room, but newly and massively arranged with the finest Victorian furniture from dead Aunt Harriet's house at Axe. 2 Canterburys, a large bookcase, a splendid scintillant table, solid beyond lifting, intricately tortured chairs and armchairs. The original furniture of the drawing-room was now down in the parlour, making it grand. All the house breathed opulence. It was gorged with quiet, restrained expensiveness. The least considerable objects in the most modest corners were what Mrs. Baines would have termed "good." Constance and Samuel had half of all Aunt Harriet's money and half of Mrs. Baines's. The other half was accumulating for a hypothetical Sophia, Mr. Critchlow being the trustee. The business continued to flourish. People knew that Samuel Povey was buying houses. Yet Samuel and Constance had not made friends. They had not, in the Five Towns phrase, branched out socially, though they had very meekly branched out on subscription lists. They kept themselves to themselves, emphasizing the preposition. These guests were not their guests. They were the guests of Cyril. He had been named Samuel because Constance would have him named after his father, and Cyril because his father secretly despised the name of Samuel, and he was called Cyril. Master Cyril by Amy, definite successor to Maggie. His mother's thoughts were on Cyril as long as she was awake. His father, when not planning Cyril's welfare, was earning money whose unique object could be nothing but Cyril's welfare. Cyril was the pivot of the house. Every desire ended somewhere in Cyril. The shop existed now solely for him, and those houses that Samuel bought by private treaty or with a shamefaced air at auctions, somehow they were aimed at Cyril. Samuel and Constance had ceased to be self-justifying beings. They never thought of themselves save as the parents of Cyril. They realized this by no means fully. Had they been accused of monomania, they would have smiled the smile of people confident in their common sense and their mental balance. Nevertheless, they were monomaniacs. Instinctively they concealed the fact as much as possible. They never admitted it even to themselves. Samuel, indeed, would often say, "That child is not everybody. That child must be kept in his place." Constance was always teaching him consideration for his father as the most important person in the household. Samuel was always teaching him consideration for his mother as the most important person in the household. Nothing was left undone to convince him that he was a cipher, a nonentity who ought to be very glad to be alive. But he knew all about his importance. He knew that the entire town was his. He knew that his parents were deceiving themselves. Even when he was punished, he knew well that it was because he was so important. He never imparted any portion of this knowledge to his parents. A primeval wisdom prompted him to retain it strictly in his own bosom. He was 4.5 years old, dark like his father, handsome like his aunt, and tall for his age. Not one of his features resembled a feature of his mother's, but sometimes he had her look. From the capricious production of inarticulate sounds, and then a few monosyllables that described concrete things and obvious desires, he had gradually acquired an astonishing idiomatic command of the most difficult of Teutonic languages. There was nothing he could not say. He could walk and run, was full of exact knowledge about God, and entertained no doubt concerning the special partiality of a minor deity called Jesus towards himself. Now, this party was his mother's invention and scheme. His father, after flouting it, had said that if it was to be done at all, it should be done well, and had brought to the doing all his organising skill. Cyril had accepted it at first, merely accepted it, but as the day approached and the preparations increased in magnitude, he had come to look on it with favour, then with enthusiasm. His father having taken him to Daniel Povey's opposite to choose cakes, he had shown, by his solemn and fastidious waverings, how seriously he regarded the affair. Of course, it had to occur on a Thursday afternoon. The season was summer, suitable for pale and fragile toilettes, and the 8 children who sat round Aunt Harriet's great table glittered like the sun. Not Constance's specially provided napkins could hide that wealth and profusion of white lace and stitchery. Never in after life are the genteel children of the Five Towns so richly clad as at the age of 4 or 5 years. Weeks of labour, thousands of cubic feet of gas, whole nights stolen from repose, eyesight, and general health, will disappear into the manufacture of a single frock that accidental jam may ruin in 10 seconds. Thus it was in those old days, and thus it is today. Cyril's guests ranged in years from 4 to 6. They were chiefly older than their host. This was a pity. It impaired his importance. But up to 4 years a child's sense of propriety, even of common decency, is altogether too unreliable for a respectable party. Round about the outskirts of the table were the elders, ladies the majority. They also in their best, for they had to meet each other. Constance displayed a new dress of crimson silk. After having mourned for her mother, she had definitely abandoned the black which, by reason of her duties in the shop, she had constantly worn from the age of 16 to within a few months of Cyril's birth. She never went into the shop now, except casually on brief visits of inspection. She was still fat. The destroyer of her figure sat at the head of the table. Samuel kept close to her. He was the only male, until Mr. Critchlow astonishingly arrived among the company. Mr. Critchlow had a grand niece. Samuel, if not in his best, was certainly not in his everyday suit. With his large frilled shirt front and small black tie, and his little black beard and dark face over that, he looked very nervous and self-conscious. He had not the habit of entertaining, nor had Constance, but her benevolence, ever bubbling up to the calm surface of her personality, made self-consciousness impossible for her. Miss Insull was also present, in shot black, to help. Lastly, there was Amy, now, as the years passed, slowly assuming the character of a faithful retainer, though she was only 23, an ugly, abrupt, downright girl, with convenient notions of pleasure, for she would rise early and retire late, in order to contrive an hour to go out with Master Cyril, and to be allowed to put Master Cyril to bed was really her highest bliss. All these elders were continually inserting arms into the fringe of fluffy children that surrounded the heaped table, removing dangerous spoons out of cups into saucers, replacing plates, passing cakes, spreading jam, whispering consolations, explanations, and sage counsel. Mr. Critchlow, snow white now but unbent, remarked that there was a pretty cackle, and he sniffed. Although the window was slightly open, the air was heavy with the natural human odour which young children transpire. More than one mother, pressing her nose into a lacy mass to whisper, inhaled that pleasant perfume with a voluptuous thrill. Cyril, while attending steadily to the demands of his body, was in a mood which approached the ideal. Proud and radiant, he combined urbanity with a certain fine condescension. His bright eyes and his manner of scraping up jam with a spoon said, "I am the king of this party. This party is solely in my honour. I know that. We all know it. Still, I will pretend that we are equals, you and I." He talked about his picture books to a young woman on his right named Jenny, aged 4, pale, pretty, the belle, in fact, and Mr. Critchlow's grandniece. The boy's attractiveness was indisputable. He could put on quite an aristocratic air. It was the most delicious sight to see them, Cyril and Jenny, so soft and delicate, so infantile on their piles of cushions and books, with their white socks and black shoes dangling far distant from the carpet, and yet so old, so self-contained. And they were merely an epitome of the whole table. The whole table was bathed in the charm and mystery of young years, of helpless fragility, gentle forms, timid elegance, unshamed instincts, and waking souls. Constance and Samuel were very satisfied, full of praise for other people's children, but with the reserve, of course, that Cyril was hors concours. They both really did believe at that moment that Cyril was in some subtle way, which they felt but could not define, superior to all other infants. Someone, some officious relative of a visitor, began to pass a certain cake which had brown walls, a roof of coconut icing, and a yellow body studded with crimson globules. Not a conspicuously gorgeous cake, not a cake to which a Catholic child would be likely to attach particular importance, a good average cake. Who could have guessed that it stood in Cyril's esteem as the cake of cakes? He had insisted on his father buying it at cousin Daniel's, and perhaps Samuel ought to have divined that for Cyril that cake was the gleam that an ardent spirit would follow through the wilderness. Samuel, however, was not a careful observer, and seriously lacked imagination. Constance knew only that Cyril had mentioned the cake once or twice. Now, by the hazard of destiny, that cake found much favour, helped into popularity as it was by the blundering officious relative, who, not dreaming what volcano she was treading on, urged its merits with simpering enthusiasm. One boy took 2 slices, a slice in each hand. He happened to be the visitor of whom the cake distributor was a relative, and she protested. She expressed the shock she suffered, whereupon both Constance and Samuel sprang forward and swore with angelic smiles that nothing could be more perfect than the propriety of that dear little fellow taking 2 slices of that cake. It was this hullabaloo that drew Cyril's attention to the evanescence of the cake of cakes. His face at once changed from calm pride to a dreadful anxiety. His eyes bulged out, his tiny mouth grew and grew, like a mouth in a nightmare. He was no longer human. He was a cake-eating tiger being baulked of his prey. Nobody noticed him. The officious fool of a woman persuaded Jenny to take the last slice of cake, which was quite a thin slice. Then every one simultaneously noticed Cyril, for he gave a yell. It was not the cry of a despairing soul who sees his beautiful iridescent dream shattered at his feet. It was the cry of the strong, masterful spirit, furious. He turned upon Jenny, sobbing, and snatched at her cake. Unaccustomed to such behaviour from hosts, and being besides a haughty, put-you-in-your-place beauty of the future, Jenny defended her cake. After all, it was not she who had taken 2 slices at once. Cyril hit her in the eye, and then crammed most of the slice of cake into his enormous mouth. He could not swallow it, nor even masticate it, for his throat was rigid and tight, so the cake projected from his red lips, and big tears watered it. The most awful mess you can conceive. Jenny wept loudly, and 1 or 2 others joined her in sympathy, but the rest went on eating tranquilly, unmoved by the horror which transfixed their elders. A host to snatch food from a guest! A host to strike a guest! A gentleman to strike a lady! Constance whipped up Cyril from his chair and flew with him to his own room, one Samuel's, where she smacked him on the arm and told him he was a very, very naughty boy, and that she didn't know what his father would say. She took the food out of his disgusting mouth, or as much of it as she could get at, and then she left him on the bed. Miss Jenny was still in tears when, blushing scarlet and trying to smile, Constance returned to the drawing-room. Jenny would not be appeased. Happily, Jenny's mother, being about to present Jenny with a little brother, she hoped, was not present. Miss Insull had promised to see Jenny home, and it was decided that she should go. Mr. Critchlow, in high sardonic spirits, said he would go too. The 3 departed together, heavily charged with Constance's love and apologies. Then all pretended and said loudly that what had happened was naught, that such things were always happening at children's parties, and visitors' relatives asseverated that Cyril was a perfect darling, and that really Mrs. Povey must not. But the attempt to keep up appearance was a failure. The Methuselah of visitors, a gaping girl of nearly 8 years, walked across the room to where Constance was standing, and said in a loud, confidential, fatuous voice, "Cyril has been a rude boy, hasn't he, Mrs. Povey?" The clumsiness of children is sometimes tragic. Later there was a trickling stream of fluffy bundles down the crooked stairs and through the parlour, and so out into King Street. And Constance received many compliments and sundry appeals that darling Cyril should be forgiven. "I thought you said that boy was in his bedroom," said Samuel to Constance, coming into the parlour when the last guest had gone. Each avoided the other's eyes. "Yes, isn't he?" "No." "The little jockey." Jockey, an essay in the playful towards making light of the jockey's sin. "I expect he's been in search of Amy." She went to the top of the kitchen stairs and called out, "Amy, is Master Cyril down there?"
"Master Cyril? No, mum."
"But he was in the parlour a bit ago, after the first and second lot had gone. I told him to go upstairs and be a good boy." Not for a few moments did the suspicion enter the minds of Samuel and Constance that Cyril might be missing, that the house might not contain Cyril. But having once entered, the suspicion became a certainty. Amy, cross-examined, burst into sudden tears, admitting that the side door might have been open when, having sped the second lot, she criminally left Cyril alone in the parlour in order to descend for an instant to her kitchen. Dusk was gathering. Amy saw the defenceless innocent wandering about all night in the deserted streets of a great city. A similar vision, with precise details of canals, tram-car wheels, and cellar flaps, disturbed Constance. Samuel said that anyhow he could not have got far, that someone was bound to remark and recognise him and restore him. Yes, of course, thought sensible Constance, but supposing... They all 3 searched the entire house again. Then, in the drawing-room, which was in a sad condition of anticlimax, Amy exclaimed, "Eh, master, there's town crier crossing the square. Hadn't you better have him cried?" "Run out and stop him," Constance commanded. And Amy flew. Samuel and the aged town crier parleyed at the side door, the women in the background. "I canna cry him without my bell," drawled the crier, stroking his shabby uniform. "My bell's at whoam." Home. "I mun go and fetch my bell. I'll write it down on a bit of paper for me, so as I can read it, and I'll foot off for my bell. Folk wouldn't have listened to me if I hadn't have gotten my bell." Thus was Cyril cried. "Amy," said Constance, when she and the girl were alone, "there's no use in you standing blubbering there. Get to work and clear up that drawing room, do. The child is sure to be found soon. Your master's gone out too." Brave words. Constance aided in the drawing room and kitchen. Theirs was the woman's lot in a great crisis. Plates have always to be washed. Very shortly afterwards, Samuel Povey came into the kitchen by the underground passage which led past the two cellars to the yard and to Broom Street. He was carrying in his arms an obscene black mass. This mass was Cyril, once white. Constance screamed. She was at liberty to give way to her feelings because Amy happened to be upstairs. "Stand away!" cried Mr. Povey. "He isn't fit to touch." And Mr. Povey made as if to pass directly onward, ignoring the mother. "Wherever did you find him?" "I found him in the far cellar," said Mr. Povey, compelled to stop after all. "He was down there with me yesterday, and it just occurred to me that he might have gone there again." "What, all in the dark?" "He'd lighted a candle, if you please. I'd left a candlestick and box of matches handy, because I hadn't finished that shelving." "Well," Constance murmured, "I can't think how ever he dared to go there all alone." "Can't you?" said Mr. Povey cynically. "I can. He simply did it to frighten us." "Oh, Cyril!" Constance admonished the child. "Cyril!" The child showed no emotion. His face was an enigma. It might have hidden sullenness, or mere callous indifference, or a perfect unconsciousness of sin. "Give him to me," said Constance. "I'll look after him this evening," said Samuel grimly. "But you can't wash him," said Constance, her relief yielding to apprehension. "Why not?" demanded Mr. Povey, and he moved off. "But Sam—" "I'll look after him, I tell you," Mr. Povey repeated threateningly. "But what are you going to do?" Constance asked with fear. "Well," said Mr. Povey, "has this sort of thing got to be dealt with, or hasn't it?" He departed upstairs. Constance overtook him at the door of Cyril's bedroom. Mr. Povey did not wait for her to speak. His eyes were blazing. "See here," he admonished her cruelly, "you get away downstairs, mother." And he disappeared into the bedroom with his vile and helpless victim. A moment later he popped his head out of the door. Constance was disobeying him. He stepped into the passage and shut the door so that Cyril should not hear. "Now, please do as I tell you," he hissed at his wife. "Don't let's have a scene, please." She descended slowly, weeping, and Mr. Povey retired again to the place of execution. Amy nearly fell on top of Constance with a final tray of things from the drawing room, and Constance had to tell the girl that Cyril was found. Somehow she could not resist the instinct to tell her also that the master had the affair in hand. Amy then wept. After about an hour Mr. Povey at last reappeared. Constance was trying to count silver teaspoons in the parlour. "He's in bed now," said Mr. Povey, with a magnificent attempt to be nonchalant. "You mustn't go near him." "But have you washed him?" Constance whimpered. "I've washed him," replied the astonishing Mr. Povey. "What have you done to him?" "I've punished him, of course," said Mr. Povey, like a god who is above human weakness. "What did you expect me to do? Someone had to do it." Constance wiped her eyes with the edge of the white apron which she was wearing over her new silk dress. She surrendered. She accepted the situation. She made the best of it. And all the evening was spent in dismally and horribly pretending that their hearts were beating as one. Mr. Povey's elaborate, cheery kindliness was extremely painful. They went to bed, and in their bedroom Constance, as she stood close to Samuel, suddenly dropped the pretence, and with the eyes and voice of anguish said, "You must let me look at him." They faced each other. For a brief instant Cyril did not exist for Constance. Samuel alone obsessed her, and yet Samuel seemed a strange, unknown man. It was in Constance's life one of those crises when the human soul seems to be on the very brink of mysterious and disconcerting cognitions, and then the wave recedes as inexplicably as it surged up.
"Why, of course," said Mr. Povey, turning away lightly, as though to imply that she was making tragedies out of nothing. She gave an involuntary gesture of almost childish relief. Cyril slept calmly. It was a triumph for Mr. Povey. Constance could not sleep. As she lay darkly awake by her husband, her secret being seemed to be aquiver with emotion. Not exactly sorrow, not exactly joy, an emotion more elemental than these, a sensation of the intensity of her life in that hour, troubling, anxious, yet not sad. She said that Samuel was quite right, quite right. And then she said that the poor little thing wasn't yet 5 years old, and that it was monstrous. The two had to be reconciled, and they never could be reconciled. Always she would be between them, to reconcile them, and to be crushed by their impact. Always she would have to bear the burden of both of them. There could be no ease for her, no surcease from a tremendous preoccupation and responsibility. She could not change Samuel; besides, he was right. And though Cyril was not yet 5, she felt that she could not change Cyril either. He was just as unchangeable as a growing plant. The thought of her mother and Sophia did not present itself to her. She felt, however, somewhat as Mrs. Baines had felt on historic occasions, but, being more softly, kind, younger, and less chafed by destiny, she was conscious of no bitterness, conscious rather of a solemn blessedness. End of Chapter 3.